Today is our last section of gene and genetics, and what we're looking at are specific human genetic diseases. And so we have 7 diseases that we're going to be looking at. The first is called Huntington's disease, and you've already solved some problems like this. Huntington's disease is going to be found on chromosome number 4. And it causes the brain to break down. There's a loss of muscle coordination. And what's interesting is that the symptoms often appear in your 40s. What's kind of sad about this is after you reproduced. Most people have had children by the time they're in their 40s. So by the time you show symptoms, you're actually already had children and probably passed that on, because this is what we call dominant. Now this is a new word for us, autosomal. Autosomal basically means not sex-linked. So autosomal can be on any of the other chromosomes, just not the very last pair. And so we see that this is on chromosome number 4, not the X chromosome. So Huntington's disease destroys the brain. You can see here someone normal and someone with Huntington's disease. It doesn't strike until you're in your 40s, but it's dominant, and that's pretty unusual. Another interesting disease is a codominant disease that we've already talked about called sickle cell anemia. And this is when you have misshapen red blood cells. It leads to poor circulation and pain. It is autosomal, meaning not sex-linked, but it's codominant, meaning you can have some normal and some sickle. So we might be writing it, if you're heterozygous, like NS, normal and sickle. Another unique thing about sickle cell anemia is it protects you from a disease called malaria. In malaria, there's a protist. It's a unicellular organism with a little tail or a flagella. And a mosquito spits on you and then inserts its little needle-nosed proboscis and drinks your blood. That's what mosquitoes do. Well, when the mosquito spits on you, this little protist can get into your blood and live in your red blood cells. If you have sickle cell anemia or are a carrier, it can't get into the sickled cells, and so you're protected from malaria. Now, we do find that sickle cell anemia is primarily in Africans and African Americans because people who are heterozygous actually lived longer. Malaria only happens in tropical areas, especially in Africa, because that's the only place that the mosquito can really survive. And so in these tropical areas, it's actually an advantage to be heterozygous because then you can't get sick with malaria. However, remember, a heterozygote times a heterozygote will give you 25% chance of having someone with sickle cell anemia. So these are 2 of our genetic diseases. One that is dominant, one that is codominant. Now we're going to look at these 3 recessive diseases. The first is called cystic fibrosis. It's where there's increased mucus in the lungs and in the digestive tract. What happens with cystic fibrosis is this mucus also traps lots of bacteria, and they have lots of increased infections. It is recessive, so we do want to highlight that. It is recessive, and it affects Caucasians, mostly Mediterranean Caucasians. We next see a disease called Tay-Sachs. This disease breaks down the central nervous system, leading to premature death, usually before the age of 2. It is also recessive, and it happens primarily in Jewish and Pennsylvania Dutch populations. Now the reason for this is we tend to see that people are going to mate within disease actually started as a mutation. But because people tend to mate within their culture, those mutations kind of stayed in the family and got stuck in that certain group of people. PKU, or phenylketonuria, you don't need to know phenylketonuria, you do need to know the letters PKU, is the inability to break down the amino acid phenylalanine. It can build up in the brain and lead to decreased mental function. It is recessive, but it can be controlled by your diet. So this is an interesting debate of nature versus nurture. Are you who you are because of your genes, or are you who you are because of your environment? And this PKU is a really interesting disease, let's put a star, because for the rest of them, you just have this disease and there's not much we can do about it. But for PKU, if we control your diet, then you really don't have very many symptoms. The last two diseases are going to be sex-linked diseases. So let's go ahead and pay attention to them. You do need to memorize that they are recessive and sex-linked. The first is hemophilia. It's where your blood doesn't clot normally. Most of us think of like getting a cut and bleeding, but also internal bleeding, and it's kind of hard to see in this picture here. But when you get a bruise, it's because you ran into something and broke a blood vessel under the skin. And what happens is that normally your blood will clot and you'll get a bruise and that's it. But people with hemophilia, they can actually die from a bruise that doesn't clot. It does mainly affect males, but carriers are only the females. Remember, males are XY. They can't hide anything on that Y. Finally, we have color blindness. It's also recessive sex-linked. Again, mainly affects males, females, carriers only, and they really can't tell the difference between green and red. So this is the end of the section of the notes. What you need to make sure that you're working on is all of the assignments for this unit, because coming up is your quiz 3.3. So that's all for today. Make sure that you do your summary box.